A 14-year-old boy gave his grandmother's blanket to a dying woman. He thought it was an act of kindness. He had no idea it was an act of war. The frost had melted since dawn, and the sky stayed low all day, pressing like a hand over the prairie. Liam Carter, thin for his age and quieter than most, stepped down from the porch without a coat. The old boards moaned under his boots, and his breath fogged and vanished as soon as it left his mouth. In his arms, he carried the patchwork blanket, a worn, sun-faded thing stitched by his grandmother, with one corner torn where the dog had chewed it as a pup. He didn't tell his mother where he was going. He didn't tell his father. He just walked toward the barn, where the fence leaned tiredly and the weeds had long since taken hold. The air out there smelled of cold hay and something else, something metallic and old, like the memory of butchering season. He heard nothing at first, just the wind threading through the slats of the barn like fingers feeling their way in the dark. Then the sound came again. It was soft, not an animal, not the wind. It was the sound of a person trying not to make a sound at all. He rounded the barn, slow, his boots crunching on the last of the frost. And there she was. She was lying half-curled beside the fence, her legs bent at an awkward angle. Her feet were bare, pale and cracked, the soles cut open like shredded paper. She wore a buckskin dress that might have been beautiful once, but now it was soaked through with mud and something darker. Her dark braid was matted and streaked with blood. Her chest rose so faintly it might have been a memory of breathing. For a long moment he thought she was already dead. Then her eyelids fluttered. She blinked, her gaze unfocused, lost. Liam just stood there, his heart a cold stone in his chest. She didn't move. Her lips were cracked so deep they'd bled and scabbed over. Her fingers were clenched around something small, a leather pouch, beaded in blue and red. She clutched it like a prayer, like it was the only thing holding her to this world. He swallowed, the sound loud in the unnerving silence. He looked back toward the house. The windows glowed with warm firelight. His father would be inside, cleaning his rifle, muttering about tracks he'd found too close to the West Ridge. His mother would be steeping tea, humming a tune that was always sad. No one would miss him for a few minutes. He knelt. The movement was small, but she winced. Not from pain, he realized. It was something deeper, like shame. Like she didn't want to be seen this way. I got a blanket, he stammered. She didn't answer, but her eyes, dark and bottomless, stayed on his. He unfolded it slowly, the familiar pattern of suns and moons, seeming foolishly bright in the gray afternoon. A gust of wind kicked dust up from the porch all the way down the fence line, swirling around them like a ghost. He laid the blanket over her shoulders. She flinched as the wool touched her skin, a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Then she grew still. She stared at him, not like a person looks at another person. She looked at him like something that was trying to remember what kindness felt like, and failing. He looked at her again. Really looked. She wasn't old. Not even close. Her face was hollowed out by starvation, her collarbones as sharp as a knife's edge, and there were dark purple welts across her wrists, half covered by the torn cloth of her dress. Someone had tied her up. Someone had done this to her. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask who, but nothing came out. A crow cawed overhead, a harsh, mocking sound. She blinked again, slower this time. Then her eyes closed. He didn't know if it meant peace or death. The wind picked up, colder now, whispering secrets he didn't understand. He backed away, stood, and returned to the house like a boy walking out of a bad dream. He thought it was over. He thought he'd done his part. He had no idea it had just begun. That night, supper was a quiet affair. His father cleaned his rifle not once but twice, his knuckles white. He kept muttering about tracks near the West Ridge, tracks of shod horses moving fast, too many of them. His mother kept her gaze fixed on the stove, her face pale. Liam didn't say a word, but he kept glancing at the door as if he expected something to come through it, as if he'd left a piece of himself outside in the cold. He dreamt of ragged breathing, of blue beads scattered across a field of snow, of a woman's eyes that held no hope at all. At first light, he couldn't stop himself. He had to go back. She was still there. Alive. Barely. The patchwork blanket was steaming slightly, damp from the faint heat of her breath. She hadn't moved much, but the beaded pouch had shifted, tucked closer to her chest as if for protection. He'd brought her water in a tin cup, and half a stale biscuit he'd hidden in his sleeve from breakfast. She drank slowly, her throat clicking with every swallow. She ate the biscuit like it was the finest meal she'd ever had, crumb by painful crumb. He knelt beside her again, the cold of the ground seeping into his knees. "You got a name?" he whispered. She didn't answer at first. But this time her eyes didn't wander. They fixed on him, sharp and clear for the first time. She pointed a trembling finger to her own chest. "Tula," she rasped. Her voice was the sound of crackling bone and smoke. He tried to say it back, but the name felt foreign and heavy in his mouth. Then she coughed, a terrible body-racking cough that bent her in half, and when she pulled away, a dark stain of blood had blossomed on his grandmother's blanket. "Don't die," he muttered, the words a plea. She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were looking past him, toward the barn. It was a silent request. He understood. He helped her up, her body lighter than a sack of feed, all sharp angles and trembling limbs. Inside the barn, it smelled of horses and old leather. Dust danced in the beams of morning light that sliced through the gaps in the walls. He made her a bed of clean straw in the back stall, hidden from the main door, and covered her again with the blood-stained blanket. She curled into herself, and her eyes finally closed, not with the finality of death, but with something that looked terrifyingly like trust. He watched her for a long time, the rise and fall of her chest almost imperceptible. Then he slipped out the side door, ducking low, making sure no one saw him return to the house. That afternoon, his father found him patching the fence with new wire, his fingers clumsy and numb from the cold. "You see them tracks yesterday?" his father asked, not looking at him, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Liam nodded, his heart pounding against his ribs. "You tell me if you see more," his father commanded, his voice tight. "You tell me right away." Liam nodded again, but he didn't tell him about the woman in the barn. He didn't tell him about the blood on the blanket. He was keeping a secret, but he was sure it was a safe one. That night, the wind shifted. It came from the north now, carrying the bite of true winter. The dogs, usually restless, didn't bark, not once. A deep, unnatural quiet fell over the homestead. Liam didn't sleep. He sat up in his bed, another blanket wrapped around his knees, and listened. Something in his bones felt hollow, like a space had been carved out of him and not yet filled. He rose, his bare feet silent on the cold floorboards, and crept to the window. The stars were out, sharp as chips of ice, but the prairie didn't look right. It was too still, too empty. He pressed his face to the cold glass, his breath fogging the pain. Nothing moved, and then he saw them, in the far, deep dark, where the prairie met the sky. They weren't riders, not yet. They weren't carrying torches. They were just shapes, tall, silent shapes, standing on the ridge, waiting. He held his breath, his blood turning to ice. And then he saw something else, something that made his heart stop altogether. A faint light glowed from within his own barn, a tiny flicker, like a candle or a small lantern. But he hadn't lit it, and she was too weak to move. Someone else was in there. Someone else had found her. He slipped his boots on, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his chest. Outside, the frost was thicker now, crunching underfoot like brittle bone. He crept around the side of the house, past the silent chicken coop, his eyes fixed on that sliver of light under the barn door. The main door was ajar. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside she sat upright, awake. Her braid was untangled, the patchwork blanket still draped over her shoulders, but her eyes were different. They were clear now, and ancient. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft but strong. "You shouldn't be alive," he replied, his own voice shaking. Something passed between them then. Not words. Something quieter. Something that felt as old as the hills around them. She reached into the beaded pouch and pulled out a small piece of wood, carved into the shape of an animal. A horse, maybe, or a buffalo. She pressed it into his palm. Her skin was cool, but no longer cold as death. "You saw me," she said, her eyes boring into his. "No one else does." He stared down at the small, smooth figure in his hand. A breeze stirred behind them, and the horses in the stalls snorted nervously. The candle flame flickered wildly. She turned her head sharply, her gaze fixed on the small, grimy east window of the barn. "What is it?" Liam asked, his throat tight. She didn't answer, but outside on the ridgeline something had shifted. Liam crossed to the window and peered out. There, dark against the slightly less dark sky, he could see them clearly now. Figures on horseback. He counted 3, then 5, then 8. All of them still, all of them mounted, all of them watching the barn. He stepped back, a hard lump forming in his throat. "Do they want you?" he asked, his voice a whisper. She didn't move. "They want to see." He turned back to her, confused. "See what?" She looked at him then, and her expression wasn't that of a victim. It was a question. "That you gave me the blanket," she said simply. He swallowed. I just did what felt right." "That's what they're afraid of," she said. He didn't know who they were, not yet, but he was about to find out. Because outside, the line of riders grew. More horses, more shadows, a stillness so deep it seemed to press against the wooden walls of the barn. The whole prairie was holding its breath. And Liam Carter, 14 years old and shivering in a barn with a woman who should have died, felt something ancient and terrible coil in his chest, like a string being pulled tight by hands older than history. He stood by her side, and far across the frost-covered fields, the ridge filled with hundreds of silent watchers, all waiting for the dawn. He thought they were her people, come to save her. He was wrong. They were her judges, and he had just become part of the trial. By morning, the frost had gone brittle. It clung like white lace to the dead cornstalks and blanketed the split-rail fence. The wind bent the prairie grass flat, and the ridge above the Carter homestead stood dark with horses. There were hundreds of them. They made no sound, no war cries, no drums, not even a banner fluttering in the wind. They were just figures, still as stone, outlined by a morning sun too pale to offer any warmth. Liam stood just inside the barn door, his heart tapping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He counted them again. First 10, then 20, then he lost count. Their silhouettes stretched back along the ridge like shadows that had decided to become men. Beside him, Tula stood wrapped in the patchwork blanket, her face as still and unreadable as the riders on the hill. She looked out at them like someone who had already died and been forgotten, only to be remembered all at once by the sky itself. "Who are they?" he whispered, but she did not answer. The barn was eerily quiet. The horses inside shifted anxiously, their hooves stirring the straw. One let out a low, throaty whinny, a sound of pure fear. Liam turned to her again, his voice cracking. "Are they here for you?" Her jaw clenched, but her voice was unnervingly even. "They are here to see what lives." It didn't make any sense, But Liam was beginning to understand that some things out here didn't come with clean answers. Some things just arrived in the silence and waited to be seen. By breakfast time, the town had noticed. A plume of dust rose from the far road as a rider bolted from a neighboring homestead, racing to spread the word. The distant church bell began to ring, not the cheerful chime for Sunday prayer, but a frantic, tolling clang of warning. And still, the men on the ridge did not move. They sat their horses like ancient trees, only their long braids stirring in the ceaseless wind. Jedediah Carter, Liam's father, stood on the front porch with a loaded rifle cradled in his arms, his eyes narrowed to slits. "They ain't moved a muscle," he muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow despite the cold. "That many Comanche ain't rode out for peace in my lifetime." Maribel, Liam's mother, stood behind him, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her eyes darting nervously toward the barn. Maybe they're looking for someone," she said, her voice thin. Jed's face hardened. "A settler? Doubtful. They come for blood." But even as he said it, there was a tremor of doubt in his voice. This wasn't how war began. Not this quiet, not this patient. Liam stayed by the barn all morning. He chopped wood that didn't need chopping. He checked on horses that didn't need checking. He did anything to stay close, to be a silent guardian. Every few minutes, he'd look up. They were still there. No closer, no farther. Just waiting. Then, around mid-morning, a single figure detached from the silent line. He began to ride down the ridge, slow as molasses, without a hint of haste or fear. His horse was a pale, scarred gray. The rider wore no war paint, only a weathered buffalo hide cloak. His hair was long and streaked with gray, and his face looked like it had been carved from river stone. Tula saw him, and she inhaled sharply. The sound wasn't fear. It was recognition, and it was laced with something that sounded like hatred. "Do you know him?" Liam asked. She nodded once, her knuckles white where she gripped the blanket. "Blue Antler," she said, the name a bitter taste in her mouth. Liam had heard the name before. It was whispered by traders in dusty saloons, a name feared and respected, a chief whose age made him more dangerous, not because he still fought, but because he remembered everything that had ever been done to his people. The old man rode right up to the front gate and dismounted without a word. Jedediah stepped forward, his rifle now raised to his shoulder. "You got business here, Chief?" Blue Antler didn't flinch. He looked past Jedediah, his dark eyes fixed on the barn. "I was told," he said, his voice low and clear as a bell, "that one of our blood lay dying on this land." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the homestead. "And that a settler's son covered her in the cloth of our enemies." Jedediah said nothing. The wind tugged at his coat, a low moan whistling through the fence posts. "My son's been nowhere near your kind," he said stiffly, a lie that felt thin and brittle in the cold air. The old man's eyes didn't blink. "Are you sure of that?" Maribel stepped forward then, her fear making her bold. "If he did," she said, her voice trembling, "he did it out of pity for a dying woman." Blue Antler finally turned his gaze to her, and it was as cold as a winter river. "It was not pity," he said. "It was a declaration, an insult." A silence fell, heavy and suffocating. From the barn's deep shadow, Liam watched the moment swell, ready to burst. He saw his father's hand tighten on the rifle, saw his mother's face drain of all color. Blue Antler finally spoke again, his voice dropping even lower. "We have come for the woman, and for the boy who marked her for death." Jedediah didn't lower the rifle. "And if we say no?" The chief didn't threaten. He didn't have to. He simply looked up at the ridge. Liam followed his gaze. Hundreds of warriors sat waiting, patient as vultures. Blue Antler turned back. "We are not here for war," he said, and the lie was so profound it was almost beautiful. "Unless war is given to us." Then Liam moved. He stepped out from the shadows of the barn, his hands open and empty at his sides, walking slowly into the sun. His boots crunched on the dry, frozen earth with each deliberate step. Tula stayed behind, a silhouette of terror in the barn's dark maw. Liam stopped right between his father and the old chief. Jedediah's voice was a venomous hiss. "Get back in the house, boy." But Liam didn't move. He looked directly at Blue Antler. "She's alive," he said, his own voice sounding small and distant. "I gave her the blanket because she was freezing." Jedediah's face went from pale to a deep, mottled red. "Liam!" Blue Antler looked at the boy, his expression unreadable. "What did you see when you found her?" Liam's voice trembled, but he held the chief's gaze. "I saw someone who looked like she'd been seen last by wolves." The chief nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "She was, and you saved her from them, only to deliver her to us." He then looked at the blanket draped over the fence rail where Liam had left it to air out. "That pattern, the sun and the moon, that is the mark of the Arapaho, the ones who raided our winter camp, the ones who stole her." He turned back to Liam, and his eyes were chips of obsidian. "You have sheltered our traitor and branded her with the sign of our sworn enemy. You have chosen a side, boy." Jedediah stepped back, his face a mask of confusion and horror. Blue Antler's voice softened, but it was a predator's softness. "You were not born into this land, but today you have made a claim on it, a claim written in blood." Liam swallowed hard, the world tilting on its axis. I didn't want to start anything." The chief raised a hand, silencing him. "You did not start it," he said, "but you will finish it." And then, to everyone's utter shock, he stepped away from his horse and drew a long, gleaming knife from his belt. High above on the ridge, a single drum began to beat, a slow, deep rhythm like the planet's own dying heart. The warriors raised their lances as one. The sound of it, a forest of wood and steel slicing through the air, rolled like thunder down the valley. Jedediah raised his rifle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely aim. Maribel let out a small, strangled cry. Liam just stood there, breath caught in his throat, a 14-year-old boy who had tried to offer warmth and had instead ignited a fire that was about to consume them all. He had thought he was saving a life. Instead, he had just condemned his entire family. The drumbeat from the ridge was a physical thing, a pulse that vibrated through the soles of Liam's boots. Blue Antler stood motionless, the knife in his hand gleaming under the pale sun. He wasn't looking at Jedediah's rifle. He wasn't looking at Maribel's terrified face. His eyes were locked on Liam. "The boy," Blue Antler said, his voice carrying over the drum. "The boy will decide. He cast the first stone. He will choose where it lands." Jedediah's voice was a ragged shout. "He's just a child. He doesn't know your laws." "He knows kindness," Blue Antler countered, "and he gave it to the wrong person. Now he will learn of justice." The chief took a step toward Liam. "Give her to us. Renounce her. We will take her and leave your family in peace." It was a test, a way out. All Liam had to do was betray the woman in the barn. He could save his mother, his father, his home. All for the price of one life that was already half gone. He looked back at the dark opening of the barn. He couldn't see Tula, but he could feel her there, a silent, terrified presence. He remembered the feeling of her hand, as light as a dead leaf, when she gave him the carved animal. He remembered the look in her eyes when she finally trusted him enough to sleep. He turned back to Blue Antler, his young face set like stone. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the air, silencing the drum. A murmur went through the warriors on the ridge. Blue Antler's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes. "You would sacrifice your family for a stranger?" A traitor to her own people? She's not a traitor, Liam said, his voice gaining strength. She was running from something. You can see it on her. The bruises, the cuts on her feet. Those are the marks of her shame! Blue Antler roared, his composure finally cracking. She fled the punishment for her crimes! What crimes? It wasn't Liam who spoke. The voice came from the barn. It was Tula. She stepped out into the sunlight, her small frame wrapped in the offending blanket. She was trembling, her face was still gaunt and pale, but she walked with a steadiness that belied her weakness. She walked past Liam and stopped directly in front of Blue Antler, her head held high. The chief stared at her, his face a thundercloud of rage. "You dare show your face to me?" he snarled. "I dare," she said, her voice clear and ringing. "You speak of crimes, husband. Let us speak of them. Let us speak of the empty grain stores because you traded our winter supply for rifles. Let us speak of the children who died of fever because you refused the settler doctor's medicine. Let us speak of the bruises you gave me when I dared to question you." A shocked silence fell over the field. Blue Antler was her husband. This wasn't a tribal matter. This was a domestic dispute that had escalated into an act of war. "Lies!" Blue Antler spat, his hand tightening on the knife. "She consorts with our enemies. The Arapaho raid was her doing. She guided them." "I did not," Tula said calmly. "I fled from you. I ran for 3 days until I collapsed. I would have died if not for this boy." She turned her gaze to the hundreds of silent warriors on the ridge. "I ask you," she cried out, her voice soaring with a power none of them expected. "Do you follow a chief who starves his own people and beats his wife? Or do you follow the laws of our ancestors?" Blue Antler lunged, not at her, but at Liam. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his age. But Jedediah was faster. The rifle cracked, the shot deafening in the still air. It wasn't aimed at the chief. Jedediah had fired into the ground just in front of Blue Antler's feet, kicking up a spray of dirt and frost. The chief froze, his knife inches from Liam's throat. "This is my land," Jedediah said, his voice low and deadly, the rifle now leveled at Blue Antler's chest. "And this is my son. You will not touch him." For a long moment, nobody moved. It was a standoff, a settler with a single-shot rifle against a chief with 700 warriors at his back. Then Tula did something that changed everything. She reached into the small beaded pouch she still clutched in her hand. She moved slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a weapon she pulled out. It was a single eagle feather, tied with a strip of blue leather. It seemed like such a small, insignificant thing, but when the warriors on the ridge saw it, a gasp went through them. They began to murmur, their voices rising in a wave of disbelief and awe. Blue Antler stared at the feather, his face turning ashen. "It cannot be," he whispered. "It is," Tula said, holding the feather aloft. "The feather of truth. Given to my grandmother by the elders. It gives me the right to speak before the council, and it gives me the right to demand a trial. Not for me, for you, Blue Antler." She turned her back on her husband, a gesture of ultimate contempt, and faced the warriors. "Your chief has lied. He has broken our most sacred laws. He left me for dead in the wilderness because he feared this," she said, holding the feather higher. "He feared the truth." The drum on the ridge started again, but the rhythm was different now. It was faster, more urgent. It was the rhythm of judgment. High on the hill, 20 warriors broke from the main group. They urged their horses down the slope, not with lances raised in aggression, but with their hands open and empty. They were not an army anymore. They were a jury, and court was now in session, right in the middle of the Carter family's front yard. The 20 warriors dismounted in a silent, disciplined line, forming a wide semicircle that enclosed them all. Tula, Blue Antler, Liam, and his parents. They were the elders, the council, their faces etched with the gravity of the moment. The rest of the 700 remained on the ridge, a silent, watchful audience. The world had shrunk to this small patch of frozen ground. An old man, the most senior of the council, stepped forward. His gaze was ancient, and he looked not at Blue Antler, but at Tula. "The feather of truth has been invoked," he said, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Speak, daughter. The spirits are listening." Tula didn't hesitate. She spoke of her husband's greed, of his secret dealings with whiskey traders. She spoke of his paranoia, how he saw enemies in every shadow and punished any who questioned his judgment. Her voice never rose, never broke. She simply laid out the facts, cold and sharp as shards of ice. When she spoke of the beatings, she didn't weep. She simply pulled back the sleeve of her dress to show the old, faded bruises that mirrored the fresh ones on her wrists. "He did this," she said, "because I told him the people were starving. He called it a wife's duty to be silent. I called it a leader's duty to listen." Then she looked at Liam. "When I fled, I ran until my feet were raw and my lungs burned. I was ready to die. Then this boy, a stranger, an enemy by all your teachings, showed me a kindness my own husband denied me. He covered me with a blanket." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "He did not know its pattern. He only knew I was cold. He saw a human being. My husband sees only possessions and enemies." The council elder then turned his gaze to Blue Antler. "You have heard the accusation. What is your defense?" Blue Antler's face was contorted with rage. "She is a liar! She shames me with her weakness, with her sharp tongue. She conspires with the Arapaho. The blanket is proof." The elder looked at the patchwork blanket, still lying where Liam had dropped it. He walked over, picked it up, and examined the stitching. He ran a hand over the sun and moon pattern. He then looked at Maribel Carter. "You made this?" he asked. Maribel, her voice barely a whisper, nodded. "It was. It was a pattern from a book. I thought it was pretty." The elder held the blanket up. "This pattern is not the mark of an enemy," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "It is the mark of a storyteller, the sun and the moon, day and night, life and death. It is a prayer for balance." He turned back to Blue Antler, his eyes narrowed. "You see war where there is a prayer. You see conspiracy where there is compassion. You have led our people with a sick heart." He then threw the blanket, not to Tula, but to Liam. The boy caught it, the worn fabric a heavy weight in his hands. "The boy's heart was pure," the elder declared. "It is yours that is tainted." A vote was not needed. The judgment was written on the faces of the council. They turned their backs on Blue Antler, one by one, a gesture of final and absolute shunning. His power, built on fear and lies, evaporated in the cold morning air. He was no longer a chief. He was nothing. He stood alone, disarmed and disgraced, his face a mask of disbelief. The elder pointed toward the empty prairie to the east. "Go," he commanded. "Walk until this land forgets your name." Blue Antler looked at Tula one last time, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that promised a future reckoning. Then he turned and began to walk, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast, indifferent landscape. He did not look back. The crisis was over. The warriors on the ridge lowered their weapons. The tension that had held everyone in a state of suspended animation finally broke. Tula swayed on her feet, the strength that had sustained her suddenly gone. Liam rushed to her side, steadying her. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw tears welling in her eyes. "You did not betray me," she whispered. "I couldn't," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. The old council elder approached them. He placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "You are a boy," he said, "but you have the heart of a chief. You have reminded us that honor is not about the color of a man's skin, but the strength of his spirit." He then looked at Jedediah and Maribel. You have raised a good son. Our people are in your debt." Jedediah slowly lowered his rifle, his face a mixture of relief and utter bewilderment. He had been ready to die defending his home from what he thought was a savage war party. Instead, he had just witnessed a trial, an impeachment, and an act of profound justice play out in his front yard. The council mounted their horses. They rode over to Tula. The elder reached down a hand. "Come, daughter. It is time to go home. The people need a leader who knows the difference between a prayer and a threat." Tula took his hand, but she hesitated. She looked back at Liam, at the small farmhouse, at the barn that had been her sanctuary. She looked at the patchwork blanket still clutched in Liam's hands. A new choice lay before her: return to the life she knew, or embrace the unknown future that had just been born from a single act of kindness. The entire prairie seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. The story wasn't over. A new, more complicated chapter was just beginning. Tula let go of the elder's hand and took a step back. "My home is gone," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Blue Antler made it a place of fear. The people need to heal. They need to choose a new path for themselves." The elder looked at her, his weathered face showing deep understanding. "That is a wise choice," he said, "but you cannot stay here. This is not your world." "Perhaps," Tula replied, her gaze shifting to Liam. "I can build a new one." The council spoke among themselves in their own tongue, their voices a low murmur. Finally, the elder nodded. "The choice is yours, Tula who walks with truth. We will not force you, but you will be an outcast, alone, between two worlds." "I have been alone before," she said. "I am not afraid of it anymore." The elder gave a final, solemn nod. He and the council turned their horses and began the slow ride back up the ridge to deliver the news. The 700 warriors watched them come, and then, without a single backward glance, the entire assembly turned and melted back into the horizon, leaving the prairie as empty and silent as it had been at dawn. They were gone. The threat had vanished, but the silence they left behind was filled with questions. Jedediah finally broke it, his voice rough. "What now?" he asked, looking at Tula. Maribel stepped forward, her fear replaced by a deep maternal compassion. "She's weak, Jed. She needs food. A warm bed." She walked over to Tula and gently took her arm. "Come inside, child. You'll catch your death of cold out here." Tula looked from Maribel's kind face to Liam's worried one. She allowed herself to be led toward the house, her feet stumbling slightly. She was leaving the barn, her first sanctuary, for another. Liam watched them go, his heart a confusing mix of relief and a strange, new kind of anxiety. He had saved her, his family was safe, but nothing felt finished. He looked down at the blanket in his hands, the soft, worn fabric a tangible link to the chaos of the last 2 days. For the next week, a quiet routine settled over the homestead. Tula slept in Liam's small room, while he took a bedroll by the fire. She ate Maribel's stew, and slowly, day by day, some of the color returned to her cheeks. She rarely spoke, but she watched everything with an intense, silent curiosity. She watched Maribel knead bread, her hands strong and sure. She watched Jedediah mend a saddle, his movements precise and practiced. And most of all, she watched Liam. She saw the way he talked to the horses, the gentleness in his hands as he brushed their coats. A fragile truce existed in the small house, a space where unspoken questions hung in the air like dust motes in the firelight. Jedediah was still wary, cleaning his rifle every night, but he no longer spoke of tracks on the ridge. Maribel hummed again, her tune still sad, but with a thread of hope woven in. One evening, as the snow began to fall outside, blanketing the world in white, Liam found Tula standing by the window, staring out into the swirling darkness. "You should leave," he said, the words hurting his own heart as he spoke them. "It's not safe for you here, Or for us. She didn't turn. Where would I go? She asked, her voice a whisper. The townsfolk. They saw the warriors. They're afraid. They'll come asking questions. My father. He can't protect you forever. And you? She asked, finally turning to face him. Do you want me to go? He couldn't answer. The truth was, he couldn't imagine the house without her quiet presence. It felt like she had carved out a space inside him that had always been empty. Before he could respond, the sound they had all been dreading arrived. The barking of the dogs, sharp and frantic. Headlights cut through the falling snow, 2 of them, bouncing down their long driveway. A truck rumbled to a stop. Jedediah grabbed his rifle from the mantel. Maribel, take them to the cellar, he ordered. But it was too late. Heavy footsteps pounded on the porch, and the front door burst open. It was the sheriff, a big red-faced man named Blevins, and 2 deputies. They weren't alone. Behind them, cowering in the shadows, was Blue Antler. His face was bruised, his clothes were torn, but his eyes burned with a triumphant, malevolent fire. Evening, Jed, Sheriff Blevins said, his eyes scanning the room and landing on Tula. Got a report about a runaway. Seems you've been harboring a fugitive. She's no fugitive, Jedediah said, his rifle held steady. This is my home, Blevins. You've got no right. I've got a federal warrant, the sheriff said, pulling a piece of paper from his coat. This man, he said, jerking a thumb at Blue Antler, is a recognized chief of the Comanche Nation. He's filed a claim. Says this woman is his property and she stole valuable tribal artifacts. He pointed at the small beaded pouch Tula still wore at her waist. Says she's dangerous, a conspirator, and he says you and your boy aided and abetted her. That's a federal crime, Jed. Blue Antler stepped forward, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He hadn't walked into the wilderness. He had walked to the nearest town and used the white man's law, a law he despised, to get his revenge. He knew they would see a powerful chief, not a disgraced husband. He knew they would see a runaway squaw, not a woman who had stood up for her people. The boy gave her the blanket, Blue Antler said to the sheriff, his voice slick with poison. A sign of their alliance. They planned the whole thing. It was a brilliant, wicked lie. It twisted Liam's act of mercy into a criminal conspiracy. Jedediah and Maribel looked at Liam, their faces filled with a dawning horror. The law didn't care about honor or truth spoken on a frozen field. It cared about paper and power. And right now, Blue Antler and the sheriff held all of it. You're all under arrest, the sheriff said, leveling his own shotgun. The blanket that had started a war was now about to send them all to prison, or worse. The world slowed to a crawl, the hiss of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, the click of the sheriff's shotgun as he cocked it. Jedediah stood frozen, outmanned and outmaneuvered. The law, which he had always believed was on his side, had just turned against him. Maribel let out a soft cry, her hand flying to her mouth. Liam's mind raced. This was his fault. His one small act of kindness had spiraled into a nightmare that was about to destroy his family. He looked at Tula. She stood perfectly still, her face a calm mask, but her eyes were locked on Blue Antler with an intensity that could burn steel. The pouch, Blue Antler said, pointing a finger at her. Give it to the sheriff. It contains the sacred sunstone of our people. She stole it to sell to our enemies. It was another lie, more elaborate than the last. The deputies stepped forward, their hands reaching for Tula. Liam moved without thinking. He put himself between them and her. Leave her alone, he yelled, his voice cracking with fear and rage. One of the deputies shoved him hard, sending him stumbling back against the table. Stay out of this, boy. No, a voice said, low and steady. It was Jedediah. He lowered his rifle and placed it carefully on the floor. There's been a mistake, Sheriff. Blevins laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The only mistake Was you thinking you could hide a fugitive on my watch, Carter? She's not a fugitive, Jedediah said, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's. She's our guest. He then did something that stunned everyone, most of all his own son. He turned to Blue Antler. You came onto my land and threatened my family. You brought warriors to my doorstep. But you made one critical error. You assumed we were alone. Blue Antler frowned, confused. What are you talking about, old man? From outside, a new sound cut through the storm. Not the wind, not the dogs. It was a low, resonant chant, a sound that grew louder and louder, coming from all directions. The deputies exchanged nervous glances. Sheriff Blevins walked to the window and wiped the condensation from the glass. His face went pale. What in God's name? Liam and Maribel rushed to the window. All around the house, emerging from the swirling snow like ghosts, were figures. Dozens of them. Not warriors with weapons, but men and women from the town, their neighbors. The quiet farmer from down the road, the blacksmith, the preacher's wife. They were carrying lanterns, their lights bobbing in the dark, creating a circle of protection around the small farmhouse. The rider who had bolted from his homestead that morning hadn't just gone for the sheriff. He had ridden to every single farm in the valley. He had told them what he saw, not a war party, but a trial. He had told them about the boy who stood up to a chief and the woman who spoke the truth. He had told them about the 700 warriors who had listened and judged and then departed in peace. The story had spread faster than a prairie fire. You see, Sheriff, Jedediah said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength, out here we have two kinds of law. The one you carry on paper and the one we carry in our hearts. And my neighbors, they seem to think their law is the one that matters tonight. Sheriff Blevins was trapped. He couldn't arrest the entire valley. Blue Antler stared out the window, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. His plan had crumbled. He had tried to use their laws against them, but he had underestimated their community. Tula stepped forward now, her voice clear and strong. Sheriff, this man is the criminal. He is an exile cast out by his own people for his crimes. The pouch he speaks of does not contain a stone. It contains this. She opened the small leather bag and tipped it upside down. A single, perfect eagle feather fell into her palm. This is the feather of truth, she said. It gives me the right to speak, and it proves he has no authority. Ask him. Ask him if he denies the judgment of his own elders. All eyes turned to Blue Antler. He was cornered, his lies exposed. The sheriff looked at him, then at the feather, then at the sea of determined faces outside his window. He knew he'd been played. Get out! Blevins snarled at Blue Antler. Get out of my county and don't ever come back. Blue Antler gave Tula one last look of pure hatred, a look that promised this was not over. Then he turned and stalked out into the snowstorm, swallowed by the darkness and the silent judgment of the crowd. The sheriff and his deputies followed, defeated and embarrassed, their warrant now meaningless. The house was quiet again. The circle of lanterns outside began to disperse as the neighbors, having done their duty, returned to their own homes. Maribel finally let out a long, shuddering breath and started to cry, tears of relief and gratitude. Jedediah put his arm around her, holding her tight. Liam looked at Tula, who was still holding the feather. She met his gaze and gave him a small, weary smile. The storm outside was still raging, but inside the small farmhouse the war was finally over. The blanket had been a prayer for balance, and in the most unexpected way that prayer had been answered. A boy, a woman, and a community had stared into the face of injustice and had not blinked. In the years that followed, the story of that night became a quiet legend in the valley. Tula never left. She became a part of the Carter family, as fixed and essential as the hearthstone. She taught Liam the names of the stars in her own language and the properties of the wild herbs that grew by the creek. She and Maribel would sit together for hours, stitching quilts, their silent understanding a language all its own. Jedediah even built an extra room onto the house for her. His hammer blows a steady rhythm of acceptance. The barn, where it all began, became a place of peace. Liam grew from a boy into a man, his quiet nature deepening into a calm strength that everyone in the valley came to respect. He never forgot the lessons of that winter, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it, that kindness is a language everyone understands, and that sometimes a single thread of compassion is all it takes to mend a broken world. The patchwork blanket, stained with blood and memory, was folded carefully and kept in a cedar chest. A reminder of the day, a simple act of warmth changed everything. The world kept turning, full of its own storms and struggles, but in that small corner of the prairie, a unique and lasting peace had been forged, not by treaties or laws, but by the shared humanity of people who chose to see a person instead of an enemy. And it all started because a quiet 14-year-old boy saw a stranger shivering in the cold and decided to share his blanket. What do you think? Can one small act of kindness truly change the world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales that prove the strength of the human spirit, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. We'll see you in the next one.